The sound of German bombers overhead had become so common that Thomas Whitmore no longer flinched when the air raid sirens wailed across the Hertfordshire countryside. But on the night they almost discovered the factory buried beneath his feet, he felt his heart stop for the first time since Dunkirk. It was March 1941, and England was drowning in darkness. Not the natural darkness of night, but the enforced blackness of a nation under siege, where every window was covered, every streetlight extinguished, every spark of life hidden from the eyes hunting from above. The Blitz had turned London into a nightmare of flames and rubble, and now the Luftwaffe was spreading its terror across the industrial heartlands, searching for the factories that fed Britain's desperate war machine. They would never find this one. Thomas stood in what appeared to be an ordinary aircraft hangar at the edge of a modest airfield near Leavesden, watching the beam of his torch dance across oil-stained concrete. Above him, wooden beams creaked in the wind. Around him, a handful of outdated training aircraft sat in neat rows, their fabric wings gathering dust. To any reconnaissance pilot flying overhead, to any spy reporting back to Berlin, this was exactly what it appeared to be. A minor, insignificant facility barely worth a footnote in intelligence reports. But Thomas knew the truth. This hangar was a lie. The real factory existed where no bomb could reach it, where no camera could capture it, where the very earth itself had become Britain's greatest ally. He walked to the far corner of the hangar, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, and knelt beside what looked like an ordinary oil stain on the concrete floor. His fingers found the hidden latch, cold metal disguised beneath years of carefully applied grime and authenticity. One turn clockwise, two turns back, then a firm pull. The floor panel lifted away, revealing a steel ladder descending into absolute blackness. Thomas took a breath that tasted of machine oil and damp earth, then climbed down into the secret that was winning the war. The tunnel was narrow, claustrophobic, and utterly invisible from the surface. It stretched 40 feet down through chalk and clay, through geological layers that had existed since before humans walked this land, ending at a steel door that looked like it belonged on a naval vessel. Thomas spun the wheel lock, and the door swung open with a pneumatic hiss that always reminded him of a submarine surfacing. The sound that hit him next was overwhelming, the thunder of industry compressed into a space that shouldn't exist. The underground factory sprawled before him like a vision from Jules Verne, a subterranean cathedral dedicated to engineering and desperation. The main chamber was enormous, carved from an abandoned quarry and expanded by 6 months of round-the-clock excavation that had moved enough earth to fill Westminster Abbey twice over. Massive support pillars, each one 3 feet thick, held up a ceiling reinforced with thousands of tons of concrete and soil. Ventilation shafts disguised as drainage ditches pulled air from 5 miles away, their openings hidden in farmland and forests where no observer would think to look. And everywhere, impossibly, were aircraft. Not complete planes, not yet, but the components that would become Hawker Hurricanes, the fighters that had saved Britain during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain, and were still desperately needed as the war ground on. Wings hung from overhead rails like the wings of sleeping birds. Fuselages moved along assembly lines operated by workers who had learned to build in silence, their tools wrapped in rubber, their conversations conducted in whispers and hand signals. The normal cacophony of an aircraft factory, the riveting, the hammering, the shouting, had been engineered out of existence, replaced by a strange, muffled efficiency that felt almost supernatural. Thomas descended the metal stairs to the factory floor, and immediately a woman in oil-stained coveralls approached him. Margaret Chen was 52 years old, had built her first aircraft engine at age 19, and was the finest production engineer Thomas had ever known. She was also completely exhausted. They all were. But her eyes still burned with the fierce determination that had carried them this far. "We have a problem," she said, her voice barely audible above the carefully muted machinery. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. In a normal factory, problems meant delays, inefficiencies, angry memos from management. Here, 300 feet underground, invisible to the world above, problems could mean discovery, catastrophe, the loss of Britain's most valuable secret weapon. "Show me," he said. They walked between assembly stations where workers, men and women, young and old, some barely 20, others well past retirement age, performed the intricate surgery of building a fighter aircraft in conditions that would have been unthinkable to anyone who understood aviation manufacturing. No natural light reached this place. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel, solder, and human sweat. The temperature, despite the ventilation system's best efforts, hovered perpetually at 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet, somehow, they were producing 12 complete Hurricane fighters every week, each one assembled with the precision and care of a Swiss watch. Margaret led him to a section where a fuselage sat mounted on a specialized jig, its aluminum skin gleaming under the harsh electric lights. A group of engineers huddled around one section, their faces troubled. "The main spar reinforcement," Margaret said, pointing to a critical structural component that ran along the wing's leading edge. "The specifications changed 3 weeks ago. New stress calculations from the Air Ministry after they analyzed combat damage data from Malta. The modification requires an additional crossbrace here and here, but the positioning means we need to rework the entire wing assembly process." Thomas stepped closer, his engineer's mind already racing through the implications. The Hurricane's wings were its strength and its weakness, strong enough to absorb incredible punishment, but complex enough that any modification rippled through a dozen interconnected systems. The spar she was indicating carried the primary flight loads, and if the Air Ministry had mandated changes, it meant pilots were dying because the current design had failed. "How many aircraft are affected?" he asked. "Everything in production. 43 planes at various stages of completion." Thomas did the math instantly. At 12 aircraft per week, 43 planes represented nearly a month of production. A month that Fighter Command didn't have, not with the Luftwaffe still hammering British cities, and the RAF bleeding experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. "Can we retrofit the modification without complete disassembly?" Margaret shook her head. "Not without compromising structural integrity. If we cut corners and one of these planes breaks apart in combat." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew that every aircraft that left this hidden factory carried invisible passengers, the young men who would fly them into battle, who would trust their lives to the work being done in this secret place beneath the English countryside. Thomas looked around at the faces watching him, engineers, machinists, welders, inspectors, all of them waiting for his decision. Some of them had sons in the RAF, some had lost sons. Margaret's nephew had died over the channel flying a Hurricane that had structural failure during a dogfight, his wing folding under G-forces that should have been survivable. They couldn't cut corners. They never could. "How long to implement the modification properly?" Thomas asked. 2 weeks if we work around the clock. We'd need to stop new production, focus everything on retrofitting the existing aircraft, then restart the line with the new specifications. 2 weeks. 24 Hurricanes that wouldn't reach the squadrons. 24 fewer fighters in the desperate mathematics of survival that defined Britain's war in 1941. But Thomas had learned something during his years of building aircraft, something that separated good engineers from great ones. Speed meant nothing if the product failed. The Hurricane had earned its reputation for ruggedness, for bringing pilots home with holes you could put your fist through, for absorbing punishment that would shred a Messerschmitt. That reputation was built on uncompromising standards, on engineers who understood that every rivet, every weld, every structural member was a promise made to someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father. "Do it right," Thomas said. "Full retrofit, proper implementation, no shortcuts. If anyone from the Air Ministry complains about the delay, tell them to talk to me." Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened slightly. "I'll need authorization to pull workers from other sections." "You have it, whatever you need." She nodded and turned away, already shouting silent orders in the peculiar sign language they'd developed for factory floor communication. Within minutes, the entire rhythm of the underground facility had shifted, workers flowing toward the affected section like blood cells responding to a wound. Thomas watched them work, these invisible heroes who would never receive medals, never have their names in newspapers, never be thanked by the pilots whose lives they were saving. Most of them had been recruited from other factories, chosen for skill and discretion, told only that their work was classified and that questions were discouraged. Some had figured out where they were, had done the math about the lack of windows and the strange sounds of their footsteps on floors that didn't quite sound like normal concrete. But they kept working, kept building, kept feeding aircraft into the war machine through channels so secret that even most of the Air Ministry didn't know this place existed. The factory had been designed by a brilliant, half-mad architect named Julian Graves, who had studied the underground cities of Cappadocia and the mine complexes of Cornwall before presenting his proposal to a skeptical war cabinet in late 1939. His pitch had been simple. The Luftwaffe couldn't bomb what they couldn't see, and they couldn't see what was buried beneath hundreds of feet of English soil. The geological survey had shown old quarry workings that could be expanded, chalk deposits that could be excavated without excessive noise, water tables that could be managed. The location was perfect, close enough to London to receive supplies and talent, far enough from obvious targets to avoid scrutiny, situated under land that had been agricultural for centuries and thus invisible in industrial terms. The War Cabinet had given him 6 months and a blank check. Julian had delivered in 5 months, and then immediately suffered a nervous breakdown from the stress of orchestrating what was essentially the construction of a buried city. He was recovering in a quiet hospital in Scotland, his role in history already classified beyond any reasonable possibility of disclosure. Thomas had inherited the impossible task of making the factory actually work, of turning Julian's visionary madness into functional reality. And against all odds, it was working. 12 Hurricanes per week from a facility that didn't officially exist, built by workers whose names appeared on the payroll of a fictitious agricultural equipment manufacturer, transported to RAF airfields through a logistics chain so convoluted that even the pilots receiving them had no idea where they'd been built. Thomas climbed the stairs to his office, a small room carved from solid rock at one end of the factory floor, with a glass window that overlooked the entire operation. He sat at his desk, pulled out a worn notebook, and began writing the production report that would be encoded, transmitted through secure channels, and eventually read by men in underground bunkers who made decisions about the fate of nations. Production Week 42, 12. Hurricane fighters completed and delivered. Current inventory, 43 aircraft at various completion stages. Anticipated delay, 14 days due to structural modification mandate Air Ministry Directive 7731B. Revised delivery schedule attached. 0 security incidents, 0 casualties, 0 compromise of facility location. He paused, pen hovering over paper, and added one more line. Total aircraft produced to date, 504. 504 Hurricanes, built in a factory that didn't exist, by workers who couldn't talk about their jobs, defending a nation that didn't know they were there. And if the plan succeeded, if they could maintain the pace, if the war lasted long enough, though God help them if it did, they would reach their target. 10,000 aircraft, 10,000 Hurricanes assembled in absolute secrecy, each one a small miracle of engineering and determination, and the peculiarly British refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. Thomas looked out at the factory floor, at Margaret directing her teams with swift, economical gestures, at the workers bent over their tasks with the focus of surgeons, at the aircraft taking shape like phoenixes being born from darkness and earth. Somewhere above them, 300 feet of rock and soil away, German reconnaissance planes were probably crossing the English coast, their cameras clicking, their observers noting every visible factory, every airfield, every target worth the attention of the Luftwaffe's bombers. Let them look, Thomas thought. Let them photograph every building in England. Let them think they understood the arithmetic of British production capacity. They would never find this place. And that ignorance, that one blind spot in the Wehrmacht's otherwise methodical intelligence gathering, might be the difference between survival and surrender. The knock on Thomas's office door came at 2:47 in the morning. He knew the exact time because he'd been staring at his watch for the past 20 minutes, unable to sleep despite the cot in the corner that he'd been using more than his actual bed at home for the past 6 months. He opened the door to find Peter Ashford, the night shift supervisor, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights that never dimmed, that maintained the eternal artificial daylight of the underground facility. "We have a visitor," Peter said quietly. "Surface level. He's not scheduled." Thomas felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. Unscheduled visitors were the nightmare scenario they'd drilled for, but prayed would never happen. The facility's security protocols were based on a simple principle: invisibility through obscurity. No guards, no fences, no obvious signs of protection. Nothing that would draw attention or suggest that anything worth protecting existed here. The surface hangar was staffed by 3 elderly mechanics who maintained the decoy aircraft, and had been chosen specifically because they knew absolutely nothing about what lay beneath their feet. "Who?" Thomas asked, already moving toward the tunnel entrance. "Says his name is Squadron Leader Davies. RAF identification looks legitimate. He's asking about production delays on Hurricane deliveries to his squadron." Thomas stopped walking. A pilot. A real pilot. Not some bureaucrat from the Air Ministry. Not an inspector who could be redirected with paperwork and official channels. A man who flew the aircraft they built, who had somehow traced his questions back to the one place those questions could never be answered. "Did he say how he found us?" "He mentioned following a supply truck from the railway depot. Said he's been trying to get answers about his squadron's aircraft allocation for 3 weeks and decided to investigate personally." Following a supply truck. Thomas felt a spike of anger at whichever driver had been careless enough to be tailed, followed immediately by a wave of grudging respect for a pilot determined enough to conduct his own reconnaissance mission. It was exactly the kind of initiative that made good squadron leaders, and exactly the kind of problem that could destroy everything they'd built. "Keep him in the hangar," Thomas said. "Don't let him near the entrance. I'll handle it." He climbed the ladder quickly, his mind racing through possibilities. They could stonewall the pilot, claim ignorance, send him away with bureaucratic deflections. But pilots talked to each other, shared information, and a suspicious squadron leader asking questions could draw exactly the kind of attention they'd spent 18 months avoiding. They could detain him, but that would require involving security services, filling out reports, creating a paper trail that led directly to the facility they were trying to keep invisible. Or Thomas could trust him with the truth. The surface hangar was cold, the pre-dawn chill of early spring in England, so different from the constant warmth of the underground factory that Thomas felt goosebumps rise on his arms as he emerged. One of the elderly mechanics, a man named George who'd been building aircraft since the First World War, stood near the door looking uncomfortable. In the center of the hangar, examining one of the dusty training aircraft with professional interest, stood a young man in RAF blue. Squadron Leader Davies was perhaps 25 years old, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd aged considerably in the past 2 years. He had the lean, nervous energy of a fighter pilot, the watchful quality of someone who'd learned to scan empty sky for threats moving at 300 miles per hour. His left hand bore faint burn scars, probably from a cockpit fire, Thomas thought, the kind of injury that happened when you stayed in a burning aircraft long enough to bring it home instead of bailing out over enemy territory. "Squadron Leader," Thomas said, walking forward with his hand extended. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. I understand you have questions about Hurricane production." Davies shook his hand, and Thomas felt the grip of someone who'd spent hours wrestling with a control column during combat maneuvers. "Mr. Whitmore, I apologize for the unorthodox visit, but I've been hitting brick walls through official channels. My squadron was promised 12 replacement Hurricanes by March 15th. We received 4. When I inquired about the delay, I was told to direct questions to a procurement office that doesn't seem to exist. So I started asking questions that probably shouldn't be asked, and eventually, I followed one of your supply trucks here." Thomas studied the young pilot, saw the exhaustion, the frustration, the barely controlled desperation of a man watching his squadron bleed pilots while reinforcements failed to materialize. He'd seen that look before, in his own mirror, during the darkest days of the Battle of Britain when aircraft were being shot down faster than factories could replace them. "How many planes does your squadron have operational right now?" Thomas asked. Davies hesitated, clearly weighing whether this was classified information. 6. We're supposed to have 18. We've lost 9 aircraft in the past month. 4 to combat, 3 to mechanical failure, 2 to operational accidents. My pilots are flying double shifts. Some of them have logged 60 combat hours in the past 2 weeks. They're making mistakes, dangerous mistakes, because they're exhausted. And I can't get anyone to tell me when the bloody aircraft I was promised are actually going to arrive. Thomas made a decision that might save lives or might destroy everything. The 12 Hurricanes promised to your squadron are currently undergoing a critical structural modification, he said carefully. The Air Ministry mandated reinforcement of the main wing spar based on combat stress data from Malta. The modification requires complete disassembly and reassembly of the wing structure. It's adding 2 weeks to the delivery schedule. 2 weeks, Davies repeated, his voice flat. In 2 weeks, with 6 operational aircraft and enemy activity increasing, my squadron will be lucky to have 3 planes left. I'll have boys, and they are boys, Mr. Whitmore, 18 and 19 years old, flying until they're so tired they can't tell a Messerschmitt from a Hurricane. That's how people die in stupid, preventable accidents. I understand, Thomas said quietly. But if I send you 12 Hurricanes with structural weaknesses in the wing spars, some of your boys will die when those wings fold during high-G maneuvers in combat. Would you prefer to lose them to accidents or to preventable equipment failure? Davies opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. He looked down at his scarred hand, flexing the fingers slowly. When he looked back up, something in his expression had changed, the anger replaced by a weary understanding. No, he said finally. No, of course not. It's hard, you know? Watching them leave on patrol and not knowing if they'll come back. Seeing empty chairs at breakfast. Writing letters to parents explaining how their sons died bravely when sometimes they just got jumped by a flight of 109s they never saw coming because they were too tired to check their mirrors properly. Thomas nodded slowly. He'd written similar letters, though his were about workers who died in industrial accidents, crushed by equipment, or killed by falls in the underground construction. Every factory that built instruments of war was also a place where death could visit unexpectedly, claiming workers and warriors with equal disregard for their courage or importance. Squadron leader, Thomas said, making his second decision in as many minutes. I'm going to show you something that is classified several levels above your security clearance. What you see cannot be discussed with anyone, not your pilots, not your commanding officer, not your wife or girlfriend or parents. If you mention what I'm about to show you to anyone, you will be arrested under the Official Secrets Act and likely imprisoned for the duration of the war. Do you understand? Davies stiffened, his pilot's instinct for danger clearly triggered. Is this some kind of test? No test. I'm offering you the truth because I think you've earned it, and because understanding why your aircraft are delayed might help you trust that the wait is worth it. But the offer comes with consequences if you violate that trust. For a long moment, Davies said nothing, his eyes searching Thomas's face for deception or threat. Then he straightened his shoulders in a gesture that might have been unconscious military bearing, or might have been a man accepting the weight of responsibility. I understand, he said. Thomas led him to the corner of the hangar, gestured to George that they needed privacy, and pulled open the hidden floor panel. Davies stared down into the darkness, his expression unreadable. What is this? He asked quietly. This, Thomas said, is how we're going to win the war. They descended together into the earth, and Thomas watched Davies's face as the sound of the underground factory rose up to meet them. That strange, muffled thunder of mass production conducted in enforced silence. When they reached the steel door and Thomas opened it, revealing the impossible cathedral of industry carved from rock and desperation, the pilot stopped walking entirely. My God, Davies whispered. The factory stretched before them in full operation, the night shift working with the same focused intensity as the day shift had. Hurricanes in various stages of completion lined the assembly stations. Workers moved between them like priests performing ancient rituals, their movements economical and practiced. The overhead rails carried wings and fuselages. The electrical lights created harsh shadows and pools of brightness, and everywhere there was the sense of controlled urgency that defined wartime production. How many? Davies asked, his voice barely audible. 504 complete aircraft as of yesterday, Thomas replied. 12 more per week if we maintain current production rates. The modification you asked about is happening over there. He pointed to where Margaret's team was working on the wing spar reinforcements, their tools wrapped in rubber to muffle the sound. 500. Davies trailed off, calculating. That's nearly 40 squadrons worth of aircraft, from a factory I've never heard of, that doesn't appear on any list, that's buried underground like a bloody bomb shelter. That's the idea, Thomas said. The Luftwaffe can't bomb what they can't find. They've been photographing every aircraft factory in Britain since the war started, targeting them methodically, destroying production capacity. They think they understand our manufacturing limitations. They're wrong. They walked along the factory floor, Thomas pointing out the various innovations that made the facility work. The sound-dampening techniques, the ventilation system that drew air from 5 miles away, the transportation network that moved completed aircraft to airfields through routes so convoluted that even the drivers didn't know where they'd actually picked up their cargo. Davies listened in silence, his fighter pilot's mind clearly processing the implications. When they reached Margaret's section, she glanced up from her work, saw the RAF uniform, and raised an eyebrow at Thomas. He gave her a small nod, it's authorized, and she returned to inspecting a wing spar reinforcement with a precision that would have impressed a surgeon. The modification your squadron is waiting for, Thomas said, gesturing to the work in progress. We're retrofitting every aircraft currently in production. It adds weight, about 15 pounds per wing, but the structural integrity improvement is worth it. Combat data from Malta showed 3 separate incidents of wing failure during high G turns at speeds above 300 miles per hour. All 3 pilots died. The reinforcement prevents that. Davies stepped closer, examining the work with professional interest. This cross brace here, he said, pointing to a specific reinforcement. Is this to handle the torsional stress during aileron deployment? Exactly. You know your aircraft. I've had to learn, Davies said quietly. When you're pulling a Hurricane through maneuvers at the edge of its envelope with a Messerschmitt on your tail, you develop a personal interest in which parts might fail first. He looked around at the workers, at the aircraft taking shape in the strange underground light. These people, do they know what they're building? They know they're building Hurricanes. Most of them know we're underground, though we don't officially acknowledge it. They don't know the strategic importance of keeping this facility secret, but they understand that their work matters. Many of them have family in the services. Margaret over there lost a nephew flying one of our aircraft. I'm sorry, Davies said automatically, the reflexive response of someone who'd delivered too many similar condolences. Don't be sorry, Margaret called out without looking up from her work, proving that her hearing was sharper than Thomas had realized. Be bloody good at your job. Make sure my nephew's death wasn't wasted because some pilot was too tired, or too stupid, or too poorly trained to use the aircraft we're killing ourselves to build. Davies flinched slightly at the harsh words, but Thomas saw him nod in acceptance. It was the kind of truth that only existed in wartime, brutal and uncompromising. They continued the tour, Thomas explaining the logistics, the security protocols, the extraordinary measures taken to maintain invisibility. By the time they returned to the tunnel entrance, Davies looked like a man who'd seen behind the curtain of reality and found something both wonderful and terrible. The 2-week delay, he said as they climbed the ladder back to the surface. I'll tell my commanding officer there's a critical modification in progress. I won't ask questions, I won't push for details, and I'll make sure my pilots understand that the wait is worth it. Thank you, Thomas said simply. They emerged into the hangar, where dawn was beginning to paint the eastern horizon with pale light visible through the open doors. Davies turned to face Thomas, extending his hand again. Mr. Whitmore, what you're doing here, it's extraordinary. But I have to ask, what happens if the Germans figure it out? If someone talks, or if a reconnaissance flight gets lucky, or if one of your supply trucks gets stopped and searched? Thomas had thought about this question every day since the factory became operational. Then we lose our advantage. The Luftwaffe bombs this facility into rubble, kills everyone inside, and sets British aircraft production back by months. Which is why we take security seriously. Why we limit access. Why people like you are told that violating secrecy will result in imprisonment. And why you're trusting me with the truth despite those risks. I'm trusting you because you followed a supply truck because you care about your pilots. That kind of determination and loyalty suggests you understand what's at stake. And because sometimes, squadron leader, the only way to maintain a secret is to share it with people who have good reasons to keep it. Davies nodded slowly. Your Hurricanes saved Britain during the Battle of Britain. I was flying Spitfires back then, but even we had to acknowledge that the Hurricane did the heavy lifting. More kills, more reliability, more ability to absorb damage and keep flying. If this factory can keep producing them. He paused, looking around the hangar that was just a hangar, concealing the miracle below. Well, then maybe we actually have a chance. That's the idea, Thomas said. Now go back to your squadron. In 2 weeks, you'll receive 12 Hurricanes with reinforced wing spars that will bring your boys home even when they push the aircraft to its limits. Fly them well, fight well. And for God's sake, don't die doing something stupid because you'll make Margaret feel like her work was wasted. Davies laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement that seemed surprised to exist. I'll do my best, though if I'm being honest, most of us are doing stupid things daily. It's sort of part of the job description. He saluted, not the casual salute of routine military courtesy, but the kind of salute that carried weight and meaning. And Thomas found himself returning it despite his civilian status. Then Davies walked out of the hangar, climbed into a borrowed staff car, and drove away as the sun rose over Hertfordshire, painting the fields gold and the sky blue, revealing no secrets, hiding everything that mattered. Thomas watched until the car disappeared, then returned to the tunnel entrance. George was waiting there, his weathered face concerned. Was that wise, sir? The old mechanic asked. Showing him? Probably not, Thomas admitted. But wisdom and war don't always coexist. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts and hope they're not wrong. He descended back into the factory, back into the artificial light and recycled air and constant rhythm of production that never stopped, never slowed, never acknowledged the existence of day or night or seasons, or any of the normal markers of time that defined life on the surface. Margaret was waiting at the bottom, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Squadron Leader Davies seems like a good man, she said. He is, Thomas agreed. Let's hope he's also a discreet man. Because if the Germans find this place because you decided to give a factory tour to someone with a security clearance lower than a lance corporal, I will personally haunt you after the Luftwaffe kills us all. Thomas smiled despite himself. Noted. How's the retrofit progressing? We'll be done in 13 days. 12 if everyone agrees to skip sleep entirely, but I'd rather have rested workers who don't make mistakes than exhausted workers who rivet their own fingers to the fuselage. 13 days it is, Thomas said, and together they walked back into the factory that didn't exist to continue building the aircraft that would defend a nation that would never know their names, September 1943. 2.5 years after Squadron Leader Davies had descended into the earth and discovered the impossible, Thomas Whitmore stood in his underground office and stared at a number written in his worn notebook, 9,847. 9,847 Hurricane fighters built in absolute secrecy. 9,847 aircraft that had flown into combat over Britain, France, North Africa, Malta, Burma. Everywhere the RAF fought, carrying pilots who had no idea their machines had been born in darkness 300 feet beneath English farmland. 153 aircraft away from 10,000. From the target that had seemed absurd when Julian Graves first proposed it, that had felt impossible during the desperate early days when the Blitz rained bombs on London, and everyone wondered if Britain would survive long enough to need 10,000 of anything. But the war had ground on, relentless and consuming, and the factory had ground on with it. 12 aircraft per week had become 15, then 18, as they optimized processes and expanded the underground chambers. Workers had died, 14 in total, victims of industrial accidents that were the price of building war machines in confined spaces. Margaret had suffered a stroke last year but refused to retire, returning to work after 3 months with her left side weakened, but her mind as sharp as ever. Peter Ashford had been killed during a German bombing raid on London while visiting his dying mother, his position as night shift supervisor, taken by his younger brother, who worked with the fierce determination of someone honoring the dead. And Thomas had aged. He was 47 now but looked 60, his hair completely gray, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, and too much coffee, and too many nights sleeping on a cot in a room carved from solid rock. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen sunlight for more than 20 minutes. His wife had left him, or perhaps he'd left her. It was hard to say when someone spent 300 days a year underground. She'd remarried, he'd heard, to a banker who came home every night and didn't wake up screaming from dreams about aircraft falling from the sky. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Margaret entered without waiting for permission. She'd long since stopped bothering with formalities, followed by a young woman Thomas didn't recognize. The stranger wore civilian clothes but carried herself with military bearing, and her eyes had the sharp analytical quality of intelligence personnel. "Thomas," Margaret said, "this is Commander Elizabeth Hartley, Naval Intelligence. She has a message from the Admiralty." Thomas stood, suddenly wary. Naval Intelligence didn't visit aircraft factories without good reason, and good reasons in wartime were usually accompanied by bad news. "Commander," he said carefully, "how can I help you?" Hartley pulled a sealed envelope from her jacket pocket. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm authorized to inform you that Operation Overlord has been scheduled for June 1944, the invasion of France. The Air Ministry has requested that your facility increase production to 24 Hurricanes per week for the next 9 months. They need every aircraft you can produce for air support during the invasion. 24 per week." Thomas did the math instantly, doubling their current output, maintaining it for 9 months, pushing workers and equipment beyond anything they'd done before. It would be brutal, probably impossible, and would almost certainly result in more casualties. "That's a substantial increase," he said neutrally. "The Admiralty is aware," Hartley continued. "They've authorized additional resources, more workers, more equipment, expanded electrical capacity, additional ventilation systems, whatever you need, but they need confirmation that you can deliver." Thomas looked at Margaret, saw her expression, a mixture of determination and exhaustion that probably mirrored his own. 24 Hurricanes per week would take them past 10,000 aircraft within 2 months, would push them to nearly 15,000 by the time of the invasion. It would also require working conditions that were already difficult to become nearly unbearable. "Can we do it?" he asked her directly. Margaret was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, calculating. "We'd need to expand into the eastern chamber, the section we've been using for storage. That gives us room for 2 additional assembly lines. We'd need to recruit at least 100 more workers, which means 100 more people who know this place exists. We'd need to run 3 shifts instead of 2, which means someone is working every hour of every day with no downtime for maintenance or repairs. Equipment will fail more often. People will make more mistakes. We'll have accidents." "How many?" Thomas asked quietly. "Deaths? Probably 10 to 15 over 9 months if we're lucky. Maybe more if we're not." She said it without emotion, the brutal calculus of wartime production that measured human lives against military necessity. Commander Hartley's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw her fingers tighten slightly on the envelope she still held. She'd delivered her message, done her job, but she wasn't quite able to maintain complete professional detachment when faced with the human cost. "The decision is yours," Hartley said. "But I should tell you, the planners believe Operation Overlord will be the decisive battle of the European war. If it succeeds, we win. If it fails, we could lose everything we've fought for. The aircraft you produce won't just support the invasion. They might determine whether it succeeds." Thomas walked to his office window, looked down at the factory floor where workers were assembling Hurricane number 9847. Somewhere up there, 300 feet above, the sun was probably shining. Children were probably playing in fields, farmers were harvesting crops. Life was continuing with all its ordinary complications and joys. And down here, In this hidden cathedral of industry, people were making decisions that would send other people to their deaths. If we agree, Thomas said slowly, I want something in return. I want a promise that when this war ends, when we don't need to hide anymore, the people who worked here will be recognized. Not publicly, I understand operational security, but officially, in records, in military honors, in whatever form allows them to know their sacrifice mattered. No more invisible heroes. No more names that disappear into classified files and are forgotten. Hartley nodded. I'll convey that request to the Admiralty. Though I should tell you, given the classified nature of this facility, recognition may not come for decades. The official history of this war will be written without mentioning this place. I understand, Thomas said. But someday, someone should know. The pilots know who flew the aircraft. The generals know who planned the battles. Someone should know who built the machines that made it all possible. Agreed, Hartley said simply. Do I tell the Admiralty you'll increase production? Thomas looked at Margaret, saw her nod almost imperceptibly. Not agreement exactly, but acceptance of necessity. Yes, he said. 24 Hurricanes per week. We'll need 3 weeks to expand operations and recruit workers. Production increase begins October 1st. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. Hartley extended her hand, and Thomas shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone who understood the weight of decisions made in underground offices. For what it's worth, I think history will remember this place, even if it takes 50 years. What you're doing here? It's extraordinary. After Hartley left, Thomas and Margaret stood in silence for several minutes. Finally, Margaret spoke. We're going to lose people, she said quietly. Good people. People who came here to help win the war and will die in accidents that could have been prevented if we weren't pushing so hard. I know, Thomas said, and we're still going to do it. Yes. Margaret nodded slowly. Then let's make sure it's worth it. Let's build 24 perfect Hurricanes every week. Let's bring every pilot home we can. Let's make sure that when the invasion happens, when our boys storm those beaches in France, they have air cover so good that the Germans never know what hit them. The expansion took 4 weeks instead of 3. The eastern chamber was larger than expected, which was good, but also required more structural reinforcement, which was expensive and time-consuming. They recruited workers from all over England, machinists from Birmingham, welders from Liverpool, engineers from Manchester. Each one was interviewed extensively, their backgrounds checked, their discretion evaluated. Each one was told only what they needed to know. This is classified, this is important. Questions are discouraged. By late October, the expanded facility was operational. 2 new assembly lines stretched into the eastern chamber. Electrical cables ran like veins through the rock ceiling, and the ventilation system hummed at maximum capacity, trying to move enough air for 300 workers operating simultaneously. The sound dampening became less effective with so many people working. You couldn't completely silence that much human activity. But the facility was deep enough that the muffled rumble was indistinguishable from distant thunder or heavy farm equipment to anyone on the surface. Thomas began sleeping in his office permanently. There was no point going home. He needed to be available 24 hours a day as problems arose, as equipment failed, as workers needed decisions that couldn't wait for normal business hours. He lost weight. His hands developed a permanent tremor from too much coffee and too little sleep, and he started seeing double when he looked at paperwork after midnight. But the production numbers climbed. 18 Hurricanes per week became 20, then 22, then, finally in December 1943, 24. They passed 10,000 aircraft on November 7th, 1943. Thomas marked the occasion by writing the number in his notebook and then returning to work. Because there were still 6 months until the invasion, and every single aircraft mattered. The accidents Margaret had predicted came steadily, grimly inevitable. A welder fell from scaffolding, dying instantly. A machinist lost 3 fingers to equipment that hadn't been properly maintained because there was no downtime for maintenance. An electrical fire killed 2 workers before it could be contained. Each death was investigated, lessons were learned, safety protocols were adjusted, and production continued. In March 1944, Squadron Leader Davies returned, now Wing Commander Davies, promoted twice since his first visit, wearing decorations for valor that Thomas didn't ask about. He came without warning, without announcement, simply appearing in the hangar above and requesting to speak with Thomas Whitmore. They descended together into the expanded factory, and Davies stopped at the bottom of the tunnel, staring at the transformation. Where once there had been one assembly line, now there were 4. Where once there had been perhaps 80 workers, now there were 300. The sound was louder, the air thicker, the sense of urgency palpable. "My God," Davies said quietly, "you actually did it." "Did what?" Thomas asked. "Built 10,000 aircraft. I thought it was propaganda when I heard the rumors, some myth to boost morale. But it's real." "We're past 10,000 now," Thomas said. "We'll hit 13,000 by June if we maintain current rates." Davies walked along the factory floor in silence, watching workers assemble aircraft with practiced efficiency. He stopped at one station where a young woman, she couldn't have been more than 20, was installing a gun sight with microscopic precision. "How old is she?" Davies asked quietly. 19. Her brother was killed flying a Hurricane over Malta. She volunteered 3 days after his funeral. Davies nodded slowly. "I've lost 32 pilots since I last visited here. 32 men who flew Hurricanes built in this place. Some of them died in combat, shot down, burned alive, killed by flak. Some died in accidents, mechanical failures, pilot error, bad weather. But every single one of them died in an aircraft that gave them a fighting chance. Your Hurricanes are tough, reliable, forgiving of mistakes. They bring pilots home when they have no right to survive." "That's the idea," Thomas said. "I came here to say thank you," Davies continued. "On behalf of every pilot who's ever flown a Hurricane, every crew chief who's ever patched one up, every squadron that's ever depended on them. We know aircraft factories exist. We know people build the planes we fly. But we don't usually think about the individual workers, the specific decisions, the human cost of production. Coming here, seeing this," he gestured at the factory, "it makes it real. You're not just building aircraft, you're saving lives." Thomas felt something unexpected, a burning sensation behind his eyes, the threat of tears that he'd suppressed for too long. He'd been underground for so long, had made so many decisions that weighed human lives against military necessity, had watched good people die in service of goals that felt abstract and distant. But here was concrete evidence that it mattered, that the aircraft being built in darkness were bringing pilots home to their families, that the sacrifice had purpose. "Thank you for telling me that," he said quietly. Davies nodded, then straightened into a formal salute. "When the invasion happens, when we go into France, Hurricanes will be there, providing air cover, attacking ground targets, protecting our troops. And everyone who survives because of that air cover will owe a debt to this place and the people who work here. A debt that can never be repaid but should never be forgotten." He held the salute for a long moment, and Thomas, civilian engineer, builder of aircraft, returned it with all the dignity he could muster. After Davies left, Thomas returned to his office and opened his notebook. He wrote, "Wing Commander Davies visited. Says the aircraft matter. Says we're saving lives. Remember this on the hard days. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. The invasion of France." Thomas didn't know it was happening. Operational security meant the exact date was classified at the highest levels. But he knew it must be soon. Knew that the months of brutal production increases had been building towards something enormous. The factory operated normally that day. 24 Hurricanes in various stages of completion, 3 shifts of workers, the endless rhythm of construction that had become the heartbeat of Thomas's existence. He was in his office doing paperwork when Margaret burst through the door without knocking, her face flushed with excitement. "Turn on the radio," she said breathlessly. Thomas had a small radio in his office, a luxury he'd allowed himself for news broadcasts. He switched it on, adjusted the dial through static, and found the BBC. The Allied Expeditionary Force has landed on the beaches of Normandy. Supreme Commander Eisenhower announced this morning that the liberation of Europe has begun. Early reports indicate fierce fighting but successful establishment of beachheads. The RAF is providing continuous air support, with hundreds of fighters and bombers. Thomas sat down slowly, his hands shaking. It was happening. The invasion they'd been building toward, the reason for the expanded production, the justification for every accident and every death and every night spent 300 feet underground. Margaret was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Our aircraft are there," she whispered. "Right now, over those beaches, protecting our boys." "Yes," Thomas said. "They are." Over the following weeks, news filtered back through military channels. The invasion was successful. Costly, brutal, but successful. Allied forces were establishing a foothold in France. German resistance was fierce, but crumbling under sustained pressure. And everywhere, in every action report, every combat summary, there were mentions of air support, of fighters providing cover, of ground attack aircraft hitting German positions. How many of those aircraft had been built here? Thomas didn't know, and probably never would. But he knew that somewhere over France, pilots were flying Hurricanes assembled by workers whose names would never appear in history books, whose contribution would remain classified for decades, whose sacrifice would be forgotten by everyone except the men and women who had lived through it. On September 15, 1944, Thomas received a telegram from the Air Ministry. Facility production requirements reduced to standard levels. Your service to the war effort is acknowledged with gratitude. Detailed commendation to follow. They'd done it. 9 months of brutal production, thousands of aircraft, countless hours of work by hundreds of people who would never be publicly recognized. And now it was over. Not the war, but the emergency, the crisis that had required pushing beyond normal limits. Thomas called a meeting of all workers, something they'd never done before, gathering everyone in the main factory chamber. 300 tired, oil-stained, magnificent human beings stood before him. "The Air Ministry has informed me," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the enormous space, "that we can return to standard production levels. The emergency is over. The invasion succeeded. We did our part." There was no cheering, no celebration. Just quiet nods, exhausted smiles, the profound relief of people who'd carried an impossible burden and could finally set it down. "I want you to know," Thomas continued, "that what we did here mattered. You won't see your names in newspapers. You won't receive medals or public recognition. But somewhere in France right now, there are soldiers who are alive because we gave them air cover. There are pilots who came home because we built aircraft that could take punishment and keep flying. There are families who didn't receive telegrams about dead sons and husbands because the aircraft we built brought them home safely." He paused, looking at the faces before him, young and old, men and women, experienced engineers and new recruits, all of them united by shared purpose and shared sacrifice. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for everything you've given. Thank you for the nights you didn't sleep, the risks you took, the loved ones you sacrificed time with, the normal lives you put on hold. Thank you for building these aircraft with skill and care and dedication. Thank you for making victory possible." This time there was applause, quiet, dignified, the sound of people acknowledging each other's contributions. And then, because there was still a war to fight and aircraft to build, they returned to their stations and continued working. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered, the fighting in Europe stopped, and slowly, gradually, the machinery of wartime production began to wind down. The underground factory produced its final Hurricane on August 3, 1945. Aircraft number 14,247, far beyond the original target of 10,000, more than anyone had believed possible when Julian Graves first proposed his mad scheme of building fighters beneath English farmland. Thomas stood beside the final aircraft as workers signed their names on its fuselage with paint markers, a tradition they'd started near the end, marking the last planes with the signatures of the people who built them. 300 names covered the aluminum skin, testaments to contribution that would soon be classified and hidden. "Where will it go?" Margaret asked, standing beside him with her cane. The stroke had left her permanently weakened, but she'd refused to stop working until the end. "RAF Museum, probably," Thomas said, "after they scrub off the signatures and remove anything that might reveal where it was built. So even this will be erased." "Yes." They stood in silence for a long moment, two people who'd spent 5 years building aircraft in darkness, watching as workers prepared the final Hurricane for transport to the surface. "Was it worth it?" Margaret asked quietly. Thomas thought about the question carefully. 14,000 aircraft, 34 worker deaths, countless injuries, marriages destroyed, health ruined, normal lives abandoned. All of it in service of a war that had consumed millions of lives and left entire nations in ruins. "Ask me again in 50 years, he finally said. "When the classification period expires. When someone can finally write the true history of this place. When the people who worked here can tell their grandchildren what they did. Maybe then I'll know if the price we paid was worth what we achieved." Margaret nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Though I doubt either of us will live that long." "Probably not," Thomas agreed. "But someone will remember. Someone will tell the story. And maybe that's enough." The final Hurricane was hoisted onto the lift system, raised through the concealed shaft to the surface, and loaded onto a transport truck. Thomas and Margaret climbed the ladder one last time, emerging into sunlight that felt shockingly bright after so many years underground. The factory would be sealed, they'd been told. Filled with rubble, the entrances concealed, the ventilation shafts collapsed. In 50 years, or maybe 100, someone might excavate it, might discover the underground chambers, and marvel at the audacity of building an aircraft factory 300 feet beneath English farmland. But by then, everyone who worked here would be dead, their stories lost, their names forgotten. Unless someone remembered to tell those stories. Unless someone cared enough to preserve the truth. Thomas looked back at the hangar one final time, then walked toward his car. Margaret followed, limping slightly, her cane tapping on the concrete. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Home, I suppose, though I'm not sure where that is anymore. You?" "My sister's house in Cornwall. She says the sea air is good for recovery. I'll probably die there eventually." "We all die eventually," Thomas said. "The question is what we leave behind." 14,000 aircraft, Margaret said. "And one hell of a story that no one's allowed to tell." They parted ways in the parking area. Two exhausted warriors from a war fought with tools and metal rather than guns and bullets. Thomas drove away without looking back, leaving behind the hangar that was just a hangar, concealing the truth that lay beneath. Years later, decades later, when the classification period finally expired and historians began piecing together the secret history of Britain's wartime production, someone would find Thomas's notebooks. Someone would interview the few surviving workers. Someone would excavate the sealed factory and document what they found. And someone would write the story of how a group of engineers and workers built 14,000 aircraft in absolute secrecy, 300 feet underground, working in darkness so that pilots could fly in daylight, sacrificing recognition so that others could have glory. But Thomas Whitmore didn't live to see that day. He died in 1967, age 70, his obituary mentioning only that he'd been an aircraft engineer during the war. No medals, no public honors. Just a simple acknowledgement of service. Margaret Chen died in 1971 in her sister's house in Cornwall, with the sound of the sea outside her window, so different from the sound of the underground factory that had defined her life for 5 years. And squadron leader, later Air Vice Marshal, James Davies lived until 1998, long enough to see the factory's story finally declassified, long enough to give interviews about the extraordinary people who'd built the aircraft that saved his life more times than he could count. "They were invisible heroes," he said in one of those interviews, recorded when he was 79 years old and speaking to a generation that had never known war. "They worked in darkness, so we could fly in light." They sacrificed recognition so we could have survival, and we owe them a debt that can never be repaid but should never be forgotten. The underground factory still exists, buried beneath farmland in Hertfordshire. It's been partially excavated now, turned into a museum where visitors can walk through the chambers and imagine what it must have been like to build aircraft 300 feet underground. The signatures on that final hurricane, carefully preserved before being displayed, are visible under glass, 300 names representing the thousands who worked there. And on a memorial wall, engraved in stone, are these words: "In memory of the workers who built 14,247 Hurricane fighters in this facility between 1940 and 1945. They labored in secrecy and darkness so that others might fly in freedom and light. Their contribution to victory was classified for 50 years, but their sacrifice will be remembered forever. 14,000 aircraft. Invisible factory. Unknown heroes. But now, finally, their story can be told." The end.